Hello, Iowa Realtors. Welcome to our 2024 legislative recap. I am Greta Haas, your Director of Government Affairs here at IAR, here with our incredible lobbyist, Jen Kingland.
Good morning, or hello.
So we're just going to jump right in. It was a busy legislative session, but a productive legislative session. I think kind of the topic that is top of mind for many of our members deals with buyer agreements and kind of the fallout from the NAR lawsuit and proposed settlement. And so we kind of knew that this was coming down the pipeline and took some proactive steps and introduced legislation. Jen, do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Sure, yes. So as Greta stated, this was kind of a scenario that we were thrown into, and we tried to maneuver and do the best we could to make sure that our laws, in effect, which they weren't in the past, that they complied with what happened with the lawsuit. So that was our primary concern with this. So the first legislation that was our top priority this year was the Real Estate Transparency Act. And for many of you, though, I think many of you know the outcome of the lawsuit, but what this did was it creates buyer's representation very similar to how we do seller's representation in the current market. Many of you have been using buyer's representation for years, so this is not new to you, but it is something where we needed to make adjustments in the law so that all real estate licensees were on an even playing field, so that everyone is compliant. And at the end of the day, I think what we need to remember with this is it's about our customers, it's about our clients and the public understanding all facets of real estate transactions. So as we drafted the legislation, very much so it mirrors what we do with sellers. It creates buyer's representation transparency, what our duties are for the buyers, and what they should expect through the real estate transaction. And that's kind of the primary thrust of the legislation.
Absolutely. So under this legislation, these buyer agreements will need to be signed prior to showing a property. However, we know there's instances in which you may have a buyer that wants to buy a property sight unseen. And so in that case, the fallback is these buyer agreements will need to be signed prior to making an offer. Additionally, we know that this is about consumer choice and transparency, and so a lot of you host open houses, and we did not want customers that walked into that open house to need to sign that buyer agreement right away. So this law also has a carve out that this will not apply to open houses.
Correct. Yeah, that was kind of an important piece as we went through this. It's not like on an initial meet and greet, you want to throw a document that's legally binding into your customers. So we thought that there were points of the legislation that we had to pivot as we moved along, and we heard your concerns doing that. But we look forward to administrative rules. That is a secondary kind of legal process that we have to go through. Legislatively, the Real Estate Commission has to adopt administrative rules as far as how to implement and enforce these changes, and Greta and Matt and everyone have been working very hard with the Iowa Real Estate Commission to get those rules implemented too.
Absolutely, yes. Looking forward to seeing the impact that this legislation will have, and obviously want to hear feedback from all of you once implementation goes into effect July 1 of this year.
Yeah, and we do anticipate that as we hear your feedback, maybe when the next legislative session comes in, if there are tweaks and changes that we need to do in order to make this work for both you and the clients, we will obviously take those into consideration as well.
Absolutely. So on that theme of consumer protection and consumer advocacy, we also introduced priority legislation this year dealing with real estate wholesaling. And so, Jen, you want to touch on that piece of legislation?
Sure. So the past couple of years, actually, Greta, we've heard from members, and particularly around the border communities of our state, we've heard about the trend of real estate wholesaling that has been happening. And what a real estate wholesaler is they basically they put an offer in on a property. They do not take legal title to the property, but what they then do is sell their equitable interest in the property to another buyer. So the transaction is never actually done officially through the county recorders, nothing like that. Wholesaling was not defined in our code, so what we needed to do was to establish that definition of what wholesaling is. The main thrust of the legislation, it says if you are going to wholesale, you will have to have a license or use a licensee when doing a wholesale transaction. It also states that you will have to disclose to both the seller and the buyer that this is what you are doing. You are selling basically your equitable interest so that all parties to the transaction are aware of what's going on. There are also significant penalties involved if one does not adhere to the law. It's 10% of the sale or $10,000, whichever is greater.
Yes. So we've heard from so many of you and hope that this will help to alleviate some of the issues that we've seen with real estate wholesaling, and hopefully with those pretty significant fines deter some of the bad actors that we've seen in some instances. And so again, not wanting to eliminate real estate wholesaling because we know it is a good practice and a good model for some clients in the market. However, we want to make sure that it is transparent to the consumer and that everyone is aware of what is taking place in the transaction.
Right.
So this session, we also got to work with several coalition partners on some legislation, especially looking at, housing affordability and availability and increasing development. And so with that, we've worked for the past couple of sessions with the Home Builders Association and several other coalition partners on the stormwater and topsoil regulation, and finally got that over the finish line this year.
Yes, and with stormwater and topsoil, again, this was kind of something that was left to local jurisdictions and local municipalities as to what those topsoil and stormwater, requirements would be on new construction. What this legislation attempted to do was to create the standards so that all communities and all municipalities in the state would have that guideline on what is required at the base for stormwater and topsoil. The legislation does not say that cities cannot do their own extra or added things that they feel might be necessary for development in their communities. But if they do take increased measures for topsoil requirements or stormwater requirements, they will also have to have some, what we say, quote unquote, skin in the game. There will be a mechanism where the cities would also have to pay for some of that, the added cost, because what we're seeing is the cost of new construction and development increases in many ways. And this is just one facet where if it's very important for the community to have those additional measures, that they also recognize that it's a benefit for the whole community and they also pay into that.
Absolutely, yes. And we hope that this will really help to kind of minimize some of the barriers to development and help make housing really ultimately more affordable for the end consumer. And so I think this is just a good first step and a good bill that we passed with some coalition partners, and looking forward to seeing the impacts it'll have across the state.
Yeah, we were very happy to support our partners in this. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. We also worked closely with the Iowa Apartment Association this past legislative session as they worked to revise kind of some rules and stipulations around property management for unlicensed individuals, but still working under the supervision of a broker. And so worked closely with them and their advocacy team to get some legislation passed on that front as well.
Yes, and that basically focused around, when we heard from them during the last interim, it was like, can we really not have our front desk folks take a rent check? Is that really what the intent of the law was? So we had very good conversations, like Greta said, where we're still trying to maintain the integrity of property management. They still have to be licensed and all of that, but we do make some allowances for front office staff to, take a rent check, get their deposit, and that type of thing. So we thought it was a very common sense approach to what's realistically happening in the property management industry, or this section of property management.
Yep. And so this bill has already been signed by the governor and actually went into effect upon enactment. So this legislation is already in effect since it's been signed by the governor.
And as with all of the legislative pieces, we look forward to your feedback. We encourage you to give myself or Greta a call just to let us know how it's working. If things aren't working, obviously, we can always work to adjust.
Absolutely. And so we know that realtors across the state are strong proponents and advocates of private property rights. And so this session, we also had to play a little bit of defense and saw some bills that may have infringed on private property rights pop up, and made sure that our voice was heard loud and clear that we were opposed to these policies. So Jen, you want to tell us a little bit about those pieces of legislation that we stopped?
So those two pieces that we had that popped up that we were like, this is kind of a significant change for us. One of them, it would have allowed for cities and counties with a population of less than 75,000 to enact short-term rental restrictions. And this is just legislation that passed a few years ago where it said that, cities and counties cannot do anything with short-term rentals. In some of our summer communities, if I could say that right, we find the prevalence or they feel the need to change this legislation, which is why the 75,000 or less kind of came about in this legislation. But you know, the short-term rental discussion is something that takes a lot of different paths when we have those conversations. It's private property rights versus renter versus, you know, owner. So we really have to be cautious when we're making any changes to the short-term rental laws in the future. We're not saying that at some point they might not be necessary, but we really felt that this was kind of the wrong strategy for that.
Absolutely. And we also saw some rent control legislation introduced this year. So several years ago, we passed legislation that prohibited cities, municipalities from implementing rent control restrictions, and saw a bill this year that wanted to eliminate that law. And so I think this year it came up right before our Hill Day, and so we had about 300 of our members from across the state come up to the Hill and talk to their legislators about the negative implications of this bill.
Yeah, and that was really incredible from all of our members that came to Hill visits. Thank you so much. It makes such a huge impact with the legislators to hear your real stories about what rent control would do in your community, what it would do for the property owners, what it actually does to the renters themselves, and some of the negative impacts that we've seen across the country with cities that implement rent control. So it was a very interesting bill that came up. It had bipartisan support. I don't think it's the last we have seen of it. I don't think the idea behind it was necessarily something that was intentional. I think what people are trying to come up with is ideas for affordable housing, and which we are always going to talk about. We are always welcome to new ideas and strategies. Again, though, we just thought this was kind of the wrong direction to take on it.
Absolutely. So obviously, very busy legislative session. These were just a few of the highlights. Monitored several other bills, but thankful that ours got across the finish line, our priority legislation, with unanimous bipartisan support. And so that really speaks to our advocacy efforts, all of you coming to Hill Day and advocating for not only your profession, but every Iowan across the state is truly something special. So we appreciate all you do. Again, we always want to hear your feedback on the implementation of this legislation. If you have any ideas for affordable housing development going forward, please reach out to Jen or myself. We are always happy to lend an ear and see what we can do about the State House.
Yep. Thank you all.